Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another U.S. 2024 presidential election forecast. Now, before I begin, once again like to shout out on my channel members. If you want to support the channel, by all means, go down into the link in the description below and join up. And make sure you do all your regular YouTube things like share, subscribe, comment below. And with that, let us begin. So, I still think, and I really want to reiterate this in like the first 30 seconds of the video, because some of you don't watch the whole video, and that's fine. I don't really care if you watch it at all or not. But to ward off people who don't watch the whole video and miss part of this, I don't think any model or any polls at this stage in August are very accurate. Why is that? It's not because the pollsters are bad, per se. It's not that anything nefarious is happening. It's just that, for example, this week is the DNC convention. Well, that's redundant, but anyways. The Democrat convention was this last week. We're still having big topsy-turvy stuff happening in the race. Around the time of recording this on Friday the 23rd, apparently RFK Jr. has just dropped out and endorsed Trump. I have not removed him from my forecast just yet because, well, I don't know where his votes would go, to be frank. So a lot is happening. And because of that, I don't think you should look at anything as set, anything as accurate or correct. This result here, where I have Trump winning, you should take this with a huge grain of salt because so much stuff is happening. The momentum that Harris has right now, take a huge amount of salt with it because a lot of things that are good for Harris just happened right now, but they're not long-term things. The convention isn't going to give you momentum for 2 more months. Now, she might continue that momentum, but it's, again, not guaranteed. And she's still very new as the presidential nominee, so there's still a lot of questions with that. Now, that disclaimer aside, I would just say that I think the polling, even with that, is settling down, is getting a little more realistic to me. And I do think in the raw polls, Harris is probably leading. And I emphasize the raw polls because the polls in the U.S. typically underestimate Republicans. And people will say, oh, what about 2022? They underestimated the Republicans in 2022. That's just what it is. If I bring this up here, we have the 2022 House of Representatives election. The Republicans won by 2.7 points. We'll take 538, for example, because people like to say 538 is particularly good. Generic ballot polls 2022. 538 had it up 1.2. Oh, well, gee. If we go to a different aggregator here, RCP's average was 2.5, and as shown here, it's about 2.7 is the actual result. So RCP underestimated a little bit. And this happens time and again. If we go... Oops, sometime I wanted to do this one. The 2020 U.S. presidential race, and we look at the polls. Again, we have a 4.5 margin for Biden, and most of these polls overestimate Biden. So when you're looking at polls right now, and the polls are 1, 2, 3 for Harris, but some polls are 1, 2, 3 for Trump, and you have the occasional 4-point Harris lead in polls. That aggregate is a slight Harris lead, but a slight Harris lead with historical records in the U.S. does not really suggest a thumping win. So we're getting something what I have here, something similar to this perhaps. Now, there is a lot of questions with this. Will this stay this way? because, as I just alluded to at the beginning of this, apparently RFK Jr. is dropping out and is endorsing Trump. Now, there's a lot of ways how people can model things, especially with who RFK's voters are. But if you look at my PV numbers here, one of the things I've done modeling here, one of my assumptions, is a lot of the RFK voters are disillusioned Democrats, and there are not many disillusioned Trumpers or GOP voters. The reason for this is, first off, RFK is much closer to Biden than he was ever to Trump. Now, he is endorsing Trump, which actually kind of surprises me. I'm not entirely sure why that is, because most policy positions, RFK is much closer to Biden. Now, Harris, maybe because she's put out some policies recently about unrealized capital gains taxes and stuff like that, maybe that spooked RFK, because that's some pretty hard left stuff. But that's still a little bit surprising to me. But the way I've modeled it thus far is that RFK's taken more from the Democrats than he has taken from the GOP. And if you look at these numbers and you naively add these RFK numbers to these numbers, you get very, very close to the 2020 Democrat performances in all these areas. Very, very, very close. Within margin of error. And I don't think that's a coincidence. In fact, you could even argue that's exactly what my modeling is suggesting. Now, am I correct in this assumption? I don't know. I can't definitively say this. There's not a ton of useful information in polls about this. It's just the type of voters who are going for Kennedy line a little closer to people who typically go Democrat. In particular, to bring this up, some of the Kennedy's strongest demographics have been women, Hispanics, other like Asians, other racial group, etc. He tends to do better with lower income voters, tends to do better in urban voters, etc., etc., etc. So his coalition of voters, based on polling, does skew towards people who would normally vote Democrat. At least disproportionately vote Democrat. So I do still stand by this assumption. And then, so now that he's dropping out, we have a really big question here. A lot of conventional wisdom is that if he's dropping out and endorsing Trump, this will help Trump. I'm actually not convinced by this. Maybe it'll help Trump. But a lot of his voters are not traditional GOP voters. And he himself is not running a campaign that's that similar to Trump. Really, the only two things you could say they're very similar with is protectionism and general isolationism. Maybe you could throw some like quote unquote expert scrutiny or concern or skepticism in there. But on general economics, RFK is more like a bog standard Democrat, whereas Trump has been running more of a bog standard Republican. On social issues, RFK is pretty anti-gun, pretty pro-choice, stuff like that. And while Trump's being really weird with his pro-life, pro-choice position right now, I don't think he really understands what is actually politically good for him. But anyways, it's a different topic for a later video, or maybe a different... Anyways, Trump has a track record of being the most successful pro-life president in ever. Trump is at least not anti-gun. It's hard to say if he's really pro-gun, but he's not anti-gun. And like you can put on other things like this too. Most issues, RFK doesn't align very closely with the GOP, and a lot of his voters are probably not going to align very closely. Now, you have the corollary to this. Perhaps Harris's economic positions are too alienated, or perhaps the foreign policy slash trade positions are too much of a deal breaker, and maybe these voters, after an endorsement, after Kennedy potentially joins Trump's campaign, because there's been talk, speculation at this point, but there's been talk that he might get a position in the White House as a cabinet member. If that happens, maybe he can actually carry some of these voters for Trump. Maybe he'll get half of them to go, or maybe more. Maybe some of them will just stay home because they're disillusioned with the Democrats now. But what I think is probably most likely is, yes, some of them, let's say a third will stay home. A third will probably go back to the Democrats, and maybe you get a third going to the GOP. And if you sit down at home and do that math in your head real quick, you'll realize that won't actually change the race at all. And I believe that is the case. Because, as I've touched on in podcasts before with Wyatt Claypool, parties, in this case candidates, represent different things. You can't naively take Kennedy voters plus GOP voters and be like, yes, this is the same thing, smushed together. That's not how that works. Maybe if you have enough wedge issues, you might be able to wedge some of these Kennedy voters to vote for Trump, or a majority of them, or a disproportionate number of them. But most of them, based on my reckoning, based on the data I've looked at, based on the polling I've looked at, is that they're mostly Democrat voters. Mostly. So it seems very unlikely to me that we're going to see much change there. I think it's very likely that this will just revert the race back to where it was right now, plus or minus some movement in the polls, but only with the GOP and the Democrats polling higher. Harris and Trump will get more votes, and other will be effectively irrelevant in this particular race. The third parties will be nothing. Just like they were in 2020, the third parties got basically no votes. Now, that said, we do have something interesting happening here. So if you remember my last video, which was for August 12th, or last American video, I was commenting that some of these regional numbers are whack, like the East or the West numbers being kind of weird, particularly the East. Well, we now have more data in, and I was correct in saying that, and now they're a lot less weird. They're much more normal. And then if we look here, we see the result of much more normal East numbers. In Pennsylvania is fairly close. New Hampshire is a Democrat hold. Maine at large is a Democrat hold. That makes much more sense to me. And I know a lot of commenters were really concerned or didn't agree with that assessment of the model. And that's just what it is. I don't try to change these things. If the model's wrong, I'm wrong. I'll learn from it. I'll change things. If I try to change the model preemptively or fudge the model, well, I can't learn, can I? No. Now, there's still a couple things that I think are a little strange going on, like Wisconsin and Michigan being safer than Pennsylvania is a bit weird. I think that's kind of just an anomaly caused by a ridiculously high spread in the Midwest. And I don't actually foresee a spread like this happening. I think a lot of these Kennedy voters in the Midwest will probably go back to Democrats. In fact, actually, to go back to the Kennedy angle, I don't think this will be equal across the country. I can't really tell you where there'll be plus or minuses, but I bet the Midwest, most of the Democrat Kennedy voters will go back to the Democrats. Unless protectionism and isolationism is really that big of a wedge. But the corollary to that is Biden and his administration has done some very big protectionist things. It's just not as overt as tariffs or trying to renegotiate trade deals. Those are much more obvious. But you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, terribly named act, that is one of the biggest protectionist measures ever signed to law. And the whole point of that act is to basically build up American green industries or American chip manufacturing, etc., related industries like that, with a lot of protectionist incentives. I'm not going to give you an overview or an in-depth analysis of what the actual act does. You can look that up yourself. There's plenty of resources online that are perfectly fine. I do a very good job of this. But the gist here is that act is very protectionist. And it's actually quite pro-manufacturing. As long as you are okay with very large deficit spending, it's probably one of the best things Biden did. If you don't like deficit spending, then it's a terrible thing he did, because it's terrible. This is from the perspective of the protectionist voter, I should say. If you're a protectionist voter, the Inflation Reduction Act is actually like a really great thing Biden did, unless you are also really concerned about deficits, in which case then it sucks, because it's very expensive. Because the reason why it's protectionist is it has a lot of issues, rules on trade and exports and stuff like that, and who can buy what. Basically saying you have to buy from American manufacturers. But it provides an incredible amount of subsidies to these projects to try to build up and start these things. And that's the point of protectionism. Protectionism isn't so much we can't have foreign goods, it's that we need to advantage our goods. And that can be done through absurd subsidies or tariffs. And Biden's doing it through tariffs because it's less obtrusive. It doesn't require changing trade or fighting trade wars. Now, the corollary to that is it's more expensive. The big benefit, though, is it doesn't raise consumer prices outside of possible inflation concerns. So I think it's very difficult to imagine you're going to see a lot of these. I think it's easy to see that a lot of these protectionist voters who might have been voting for Kennedy or supporting Kennedy will come back home to the Democrats. And this might bolster Harris quite significantly. If it doesn't, if Kennedy does truly bring even 50% of these voters to Donald Trump, the election's over. End of story. Because the thing that has to be remembered with this particular election, Trump, no matter what was happening, no matter what was going on in this election, there was no chance that Trump is getting less than about 63 million votes. And there's a good chance he could get up to 74 million votes. Those are the 2016 and 2020 results for him. There is just almost no reality where Trump gets outside that 63 to 74 million vote range. He's well known. Everyone knows what Trump is. There is just no capacity for him to gain meaningful numbers. And if you look at the polling, he's gaining like 5% of the Biden voters, but he's losing about 5% of his voters from 2020 to Harris. So, and he's losing some voters to other people, etc. He has a 91% retention. Harris has a 91% retention. Pretty normal stuff for the U.S. and any two-party system, having about 91% retention. So if we take that, and let's say he has a 91% retention from his 2020 numbers. So he has 91% of 74 million. Bear with me one second. So that's 67 million. And let's say he gets 5% of 81 million, and he's at 71 million. I think that's a pretty realistic vote total for Trump. It could be a little lower, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it has to be in the 70 million range, but that's probably where he's going to be. And I think that's always how this is going to be. I think if I were to make a video like this on November 6th, 2021, it would have been like this. Trump, as the nominee, is going to get approximately the range that Trump has been getting in votes already. This isn't rocket science. This isn't even that crazy. You look at Obama 1 versus Obama 2, and it's versus Hillary, which some people have called Obama 3, but I don't think that's necessarily fair. They're all in the same vote range. You look at Bush 2004 and Romney 2012, about the same number of votes. It's only about 1 million votes different. This is the kind of thing we expect. Parties are going to get roughly the same, especially in a very polarized two-party system like the US has. Parties are going to get roughly the same amount of votes every time. 2012 and 2020 have almost the same vote share percentages for the Democrats and Republicans. It's just more people voted in 2020, which is partially due to population growth, partially just due to turnout being almost 8% higher. So where does this play with Harris, with RFK? Well, the whole question in this election, and what's actually making this an election, and not just a rout, is will Harris be able to maintain Biden's vote coalition from 2020? And that, I think, is unlikely. A lot of Biden voters in 2020 were people who could only be turned out because it was so... vote by mail was brand new. There was such a big concern with the riots going on and all the craziness with COVID that it was easy to drive out very low propensity voters. That's why the turnout increased 6.5% from 2016 to 2020. It was a very high turnout year because of the specificities of the riots and COVID. We don't have that in 2024. At least, hopefully, we won't have that in 2024. I'm sure no one wants more riots nor more COVID. So I don't think we're going to see Harris, no matter her qualities or negatives, getting anywhere close to 81 million votes. Now, you could also likely say that Trump won't get anywhere close to 74 million. And I think that's reasonable. I think Trump could very well do worse than 74 million votes. He won't do worse than 63 million, though. Won't do worse than that. But let's say, for sake of argument, that Trump gets... or we'll ignore Trump's vote share here momentarily, and we'll just talk about Biden. If Biden loses... Harris... I'm confusing myself with my notes here. If Harris loses 5% of her votes to third parties, which is what the polling currently suggests is from 2020, and all turnout is otherwise equal, so instead of getting 81 million votes, Harris gets 77 million votes. She loses some voters to Trump. She gains some voters from Trump, so that's approximately a wash, let's say. If it goes to 77 to 74 million, roughly give or take like a 2% margin, Trump wins using a 2020 vote distribution. Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, we're all fairly close. You can even go so far and say states like Nevada or like New Hampshire are not terribly far apart if you remove 5 million voters from the Democrats. So, and that's really what this question of this election boils down to. If we assume the Trump vote is going to be roughly the same as it was before, and we assume turnout's almost certainly going to decline this election because all the specificities that made 2020 so high turnout do not apply this year, then we're going to see turnout plummet. And that means Harris campaign and the Trump campaign, the Democrats and Republicans, are going to get a lot fewer votes this cycle. And because the last 4 years haven't been very good, just look at every election everywhere where the incumbent has done pretty bad in the last few years. Very high inflation is very bad for incumbents. It doesn't matter if you fixed the inflation while you're still in office. The fact that it ever happened damages you very heavily. Voters don't forgive very easily to a current incumbent government. The adage that some people I have heard say, which is voters are stupid, or voters forget, or they have short memories, is not true. The accurate way to phrase that and understand that is voters don't remember things that don't affect them, but as soon as you hurt them, they will never forgive you. If you read Machiavelli, that actually would make a lot of sense to you, in very much the same sense. If you're going to damage a man, you better kill him because he will never forgive you afterwards for hurting him. Paraphrasing. And I'm not endorsing killing people, I'm just quoting Machiavelli. And Machiavelli is actually a very useful way to interpret and understand politics. Because that's a lot of ways how politics actually is, minus murdering people. Hopefully. We've evolved past that, hopefully. Probably haven't, to be honest, but let's just hope we have. Let's hope we have. So, Biden/Harris are going into this election cycle with this huge negative. They had really high inflation during their term. I think it hit like 8 to 9%. That's really hard to come back from. That's going to drive a lot of people away from them. I don't think it's going to drive them to Trump. Right now, I think it's actually driven them to people like Kennedy or possibly the third parties or just not voting. So I think it's very likely that Democrat turnout is going to drop faster than Republican turnout. So let's say turnout in this election is only 60%. Trump is definitely going to get fewer votes. Absolutely, fewer votes. He might get 63 million votes. So it might be like 11 million fewer. But I don't think you're going to see the Democrats get 66 million votes like Hillary did. That's just not what I see in the cards right now. Now, if as Kennedy drops out and we get more and more polls without Kennedy, maybe the Democrats rebound. We'll get closer to 66 million. But does it also come at the price that possibly Trump will gain more votes? Again, we'll have to see. We don't really know. We have a huge what if at the creation of this video for this week. I don't think it's too early to call anything. Especially if this dropout actually does happen. As I saw reported at the time of recording. So, all this to say, I don't think it's reasonable or prudent to really take anything with a grain of salt until mid-September. We really need things to cool down, calm down, and maybe things will be trending more in Harris's favor. I've looked at some things and I have higher recency bias. I'm increasing my recency bias every update, by the way, because I do increase it going towards elections, but right now it's still relatively low. I'm not going to say the number because proprietary concerns, but anyways, proprietary reasons. But I am increasing it over time. And at the time of recording this, if I max it out to where I want it to be on election day, which is what I do for every election day, Harris does have a slight popular vote lead of 0.2. She ends up flipping another state, which I believe is Pennsylvania. Yeah, Pennsylvania flips. Which, again, is a bit weird. I expect actually Pennsylvania to stay more Trump than Michigan or Wisconsin, because generally speaking, Pennsylvania is more Republican than the other two. But that's a whole nother story. Outside of scope for this video. So she's definitely has momentum. She's definitely gaining ground. If you just flip Pennsylvania's 19 votes, I believe it is this cycle, you get to 260 to, 188. 288, sorry. So a fairly narrow Trump electoral college win. Will it be like that? Will it be that narrow? I don't know. It's too early to call it, really. Truly, it's an unsatisfying thing to say. I have projection, because I'm not going to be one of those people who say it's toss-ups. I have courage. I'll put my name on something. I'll happily be wrong. Either way. Doesn't matter. Who really cares that much, right? Like, I'll be honest, my original creation of this channel was more the forecast side, but now the analysis side is the part that gets me more interested. And I hope, from what I can tell from my analytics, that's actually what the viewers come here for more than the projections, or at least people who actually give me the watch time. There's a lot of people who just click on these videos to see the projection, which is fine. Whatever floats your boat. But the people who actually stay and watch these seem to stay more for the analysis than anything else. And, well, I assume they're the same boat. But with that, I'll bid you guys all do that. It is really the summary of this. I'm trying not to keep these too long or too rambly, but, you know, it is what it is. I'm not the hugest fan of editing, so I don't usually do it. Well, I bid you do. And I'll see you next week, hopefully, with something different.